Have you ever wondered why a man's confidence begins to tremble the moment a woman stops explaining herself? It is not her silence that disturbs him, but the realization that his control has dissolved into air, that her validation is no longer a currency he can spend. In Jungian terms, this is when the projection collapses. The image he built of her compliant, understanding, infinitely patient, shatters under the weight of her quiet refusal. What remains is not the woman he thought he knew, but the mirror of his own shadow staring back. When a woman stops explaining, she is no longer negotiating with illusion. She no longer dances around the edges of his insecurity, offering comfort to the ego that demands constant reassurance. Her stillness becomes the sound of boundaries. Her detachment becomes the sermon of self-respect. To the unawakened man, this feels like abandonment. But to the woman, it is resurrection, the quiet revolution of reclaiming her inner authority. Most men conditioned by centuries of patriarchal narrative do not understand this moment. They have been taught to see a woman's emotional availability as proof of love, her explanations as proof of care, her forgiveness as proof of weakness. When she withdraws these, when she steps into the sacred ground of her own silence, he faces the unbearable truth. The feminine does not exist to soothe his chaos. The feminine exists to reveal it. In Jung's language, the man has met the anima, not as fantasy, but as confrontation. The woman's silence becomes the echo of every unhealed wound he buried under ambition, pride, or dominance. Her refusal to explain triggers the part of him that cannot tolerate mystery, the part that seeks to own what should only be honored. It is not her absence he fears, but the void within himself that her absence exposes. You see, when you stop explaining yourself, you remove the ego's favorite drug, control. You no longer perform for approval or bend for peace. You choose detachment not out of indifference, but out of clarity. It is the highest act of emotional maturity to know that your worth does not need to be understood to be real. Men who are still entangled in their own projections mistake this for cruelty. They cannot see that silence is not punishment. It is truth in its purest form. In every dynamic between the masculine and feminine, there is a silent negotiation of power, not the crude kind that demands submission, but the subtle psychological kind that shapes emotional gravity. When she explains, she gives. When she justifies, she yields. When she apologizes for being misunderstood, she unknowingly hands him the power to define her. And yet the moment she stops, that invisible current reverses. He feels it first in the body, a tightening in the chest, an unspoken anxiety, the primitive fear of losing control. Carl Jung wrote that man protects himself against being submerged in the unconscious feminine by repressing his anima. But the repression does not make her vanish. It makes her more powerful. When a woman stops explaining, she is no longer feeding his repression. She becomes the embodiment of the anima, mysterious, intuitive beyond logic. The man feels this as terror, because his rational ego cannot categorize her anymore. She becomes unpredictable, elemental, almost divine. To the woman watching this unfold, understand this: your silence is not emptiness. It is energy retracted from a place that no longer deserves it. The man who truly sees you will not be frightened by your stillness. He will be humbled by it. But the one who is drawn only to your compliance will panic. He will accuse guilt or plead anything to pull you back into the old rhythm where he felt powerful. That is the moment of truth. That is where individuation begins. The silence you give him is not absence. It is the mirror of his soul unfiltered. And few men are prepared for that reflection. In Jung's theory, individuation, the process of becoming whole, always begins with confrontation. The feminine withdraws not to punish, but to allow the masculine to face himself. Her silence becomes his initiation, her detachment, the teacher of his humility. Do you know why this feels so potent? Because energy, once reclaimed, radiates differently. A woman who no longer explains herself moves differently. Her words carry weight even when unspoken. Her gaze no longer asks, it observes. Her presence becomes rare, almost sacred, and that rarity awakens something primal in the man, a hunger not just for her body, but for the mystery he destroyed by trying to own it. He begins to remember what he once forgot, that love without reverence becomes control, and control is the death of intimacy. When she stops explaining, she resurrects that reverence. She becomes the embodiment of the eternal feminine, not as caretaker, but as consciousness itself. He may rage, he may plead, he may promise change, but beneath it all, he feels what Jung described as the terrifying beauty of the anima revealed. What the man fears most is not losing her. It is being seen by her in the moment she no longer needs him to understand. That is the true terror, the collapse of his illusion, the nakedness of his own soul reflected back without judgment, without justification, without sound. And in that silence, she becomes untouchable. In the days that follow her silence, something begins to shift in the air, a tension that words cannot hold. He senses it before he understands it, the withdrawal of her emotional gravity. Once she orbited around his moods, adjusted her tone to soothe his storms, softened herself to make his world less chaotic. Now she has gone still, not cold, just still. It's a silence that does not seek reconciliation. It seeks clarity. What unsettles him most is that she doesn't seem angry. Anger he could fight? Anger is familiar. But this quiet detachment feels like standing in front of a mirror that no longer reflects him. The Jungian psyche trembles here, because what he sees in her absence is not punishment, it is truth, stripped of projection. For years, he mistook her empathy for agreement, her forgiveness for weakness, her listening for consent. Her silence now exposes those illusions like a sudden light in a darkened room. She, on the other hand, begins to see with new eyes. The compulsion to explain was never love. It was survival. It came from the deep, unconscious training to maintain harmony, to be understood, to avoid abandonment. Jung would have called this the persona of the pleaser, the mask worn by the woman who has been taught that her safety lies in the comfort of others. But masks grow heavy. And one day the woman realizes that peace cannot be negotiated with misunderstanding. It can only be chosen. You may recognize this moment in yourself, the point where words feel useless, where no explanation will make someone see you more clearly. It is the moment your soul whispers, "Stop proving your truth to those committed to misunderstanding it." When that happens, you don't harden. You simply detach. Detachment in its purest form is not distance. It is sacred protection of energy. It is the conscious refusal to pour into an emotional void. Men who are unaccustomed to depth will call this manipulation. They will say, "You've changed." But the truth is, you've remembered who you were before you were made small. You've become aligned with what Jung called the self, the totality of consciousness and unconsciousness integrated. In that alignment, explanation feels unnecessary. You no longer justify your boundaries, your feelings, your silence. You simply inhabit them. To the man, this quiet confidence feels like rejection. His ego interprets it as loss, but his soul, though he may not admit it, feels awe. The feminine in her integrated state awakens something ancient in him, something that has slept beneath layers of performance and pride. It's the masculine's longing for union, not with her body, but with his own unclaimed depths. Yet to reach that, he must endure the discomfort of uncertainty, the ache of not being in control. That is his initiation. The woman's silence is not cruelty, it's alchemy. She has taken pain, the pain of being misunderstood, unheard, minimized, and transmuted it into power. Not the loud, aggressive kind, but the subtle, magnetic kind that comes from emotional mastery. The more she centers herself, the more he feels the pull. Jung spoke often of this polarity. When the feminine retreats inward, the masculine is drawn toward her not because she chases, but because she radiates the completeness he lacks. There is a moment in every man's life when he realizes that he cannot conquer what he cannot understand. This is that moment. His strategies, persuasion, argument, charm begin to fail. Logic collapses against mystery. He feels both fascinated and frightened. Her silence becomes the unknown. He cannot analyze the sacred space that mirrors his own emptiness. It's not the loss of her voice that haunts him, but the loss of access to her emotional world, that secret garden he once mistook for his own. And so he stands at the edge of something spiritual. Some men will retreat seeking comfort in distraction. Others will awaken. The awakened man does not chase her words. He listens to her silence. He learns to sit with the discomfort it brings, to examine what it reveals within him. The shadow begins to emerge, the part that equated love with dominance, attention, with control, affection, with certainty. In confronting this shadow, he begins his own individuation. But the woman, she is no longer waiting for that. Her path has turned inward. She walks now in a space where self-worth is not up for debate. She speaks less but feels more. She moves not from reaction, but from intuition. In Jungian terms, she has integrated her animus, her inner masculine, and no longer seeks external validation to complete her. She has become what Jung called a vessel of consciousness, and the world feels her difference. People sense it without knowing why. The calm authority in her energy, the lack of need to be liked, the peace that comes from self-possession. When she walks into a room, men feel both drawn and disarmed. There is no performance, no explanation, only presence. It is the energy of a woman who has remembered that her silence is not absence, but essence. The man standing before this mystery feels both longing and fear. He cannot decide if he wants to possess her or pray to her, because in her silence, he sees something eternal, the reflection of his own lost wholeness. There is a certain kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of power. When a woman reaches that state, her entire being vibrates at a different frequency, calm, self-contained, luminous, from within. She no longer wastes energy trying to correct distorted perceptions. The truth has stopped being something she must explain. It has become something she simply embodies. For the man who once thrived on her openness, this shift is seismic. His instincts tell him something profound has changed, even if he cannot name it. He feels her absence, like a phantom limb still reaching for responses, still waiting for reassurance. But there are none. The woman who once justified her emotions now merely feels them. The one who once explained her boundaries now holds them without defense. This is not arrogance. It is integration. Carl Jung often spoke of the withdrawal of projections as the most painful but necessary step toward maturity. When she stops explaining, she is withdrawing his projection from her. She is no longer willing to carry the weight of his unresolved wounds, the need to be right, to be admired, to be mothered by her compassion. Her silence says, "Return what is yours. I am not your mirror anymore." You may notice that when you stop over-explaining, the world around you rearranges itself. People who only valued your compliance drift away. Those who can meet you in truth begin to appear. This is how individuation unfolds, through loss that is actually liberation. In the space left behind, You begin to hear your own voice again, the one that existed before you learned to shrink it for someone else's comfort. To the unhealed man, your stillness feels like abandonment. But to the conscious man, it feels like initiation. He senses that your detachment is not indifference, but discernment, a test of whether he can meet you at the level of soul rather than ego. Jung might call this the encounter with the numinous feminine, the moment when the masculine realizes that love is not possession, but participation in something larger than himself. The woman's silence then becomes sacred ground. It is the temple where she meets herself again. Her energy, once scattered in explanations and appeasements, begins to gather like light returning to its source. From that center, she no longer chases understanding. She emanates it. Her very presence becomes instruction. Without speaking, she teaches the difference between reaction and wisdom, between love that needs and love that knows. And yet this transformation does not happen without grief. To stop explaining is to mourn the girl who believed that clarity would earn her love. It means facing the ache of realizing that some will never understand, no matter how gently she speaks. But there is beauty in this mourning, a purification of sorts. The tears that once fell for a recognition now fall for release. Through that release, she grows lighter, clearer, freer. The man watching her evolve faces his own dark night of the soul. The silence presses on him like gravity, forcing him to confront what her words once protected him from himself. Without her explanations, he must navigate the terrain of his own insecurity. Without her emotional labor, he must meet his own shadow. And this is where the true terror lies, not in losing her voice, but in hearing his own unfiltered thoughts echo in the void she leaves behind. Some will run from that echo. They will seek noise, new distractions, new women, new stories, anything to drown out the silence. But the few who stay, who listen, who let the silence work on them, will begin to change. They will begin to understand that what they feared was never her silence, but their own lack of inner peace. In her detachment, they see the reflection of their unintegrated feminine, the part of them that longs for softness, yet fears surrender. And you, the woman who chose silence, begin to realize that this choice was never about him. It was about energy, where it flows, where it drains, where it returns. You learn that explanation is a kind of begging, a subtle request for validation, disguised as communication. Once you see that you can never unsee it, your words become sacred currency spent only where there is reciprocity. The feminine energy that stops explaining becomes magnetic, not because it withholds, but because it radiates sovereignty. A man cannot manipulate what he cannot predict, and he cannot predict what is free. Freedom to the unconscious looks like danger, but to the awakened, it looks like divinity. As Jung wrote, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The silence of the integrated feminine is precisely that reaction, catalytic, uncontrollable, purifying. The man who meets her at this level must either evolve or retreat. There is no middle ground. And she, standing in her quiet knowing, watches without attachment. She no longer seeks to convince anyone of her intentions, her love, or her worth. She knows that explanation is for those who doubt. Truth, on the other hand, needs no audience. The silence becomes her language. The stillness becomes her strength. In the depth of that silence, something ancient awakens. The woman who once built her identity around understanding others begins to understand herself. What once felt like loneliness now feels like sacred solitude, the space where her own intuition, long muted beneath layers of justification, finally speaks clearly. It doesn't shout. It whispers truths that were always there. You were never meant to be understood by everyone. You were meant to be aligned with yourself. This realization changes everything. Her posture softens, but her presence sharpens. She moves through the world as if she carries a secret, not one she hides, but one too sacred to be explained. Jung called this the integration of the shadow, the moment when what was once denied becomes accepted and transformed. For her, it means no longer apologizing for her emotions, her silence, her intensity, or her complexity. She is no longer fragmented between being understood and being authentic. She has chosen authenticity. And for the man watching her transformation, this is both mesmerizing and unbearable. He feels her withdrawal as a kind of energetic earthquake, subtle yet destabilizing. Once he defined her through his need, the comforter, the listener, the one who filled his empty spaces with reassurance. Now faced with a woman who does not perform softness for approval, he encounters a power he cannot possess. The masculine ego, untempered by self-awareness, often seeks control through explanation. He wants to label, to decode, to analyze, as though understanding her would grant him mastery. But her silence denies him that. It reminds him that the feminine cannot be solved. She can only be experienced. And that experience requires surrender, something the ego resists until it breaks. In this breaking, something essential happens. The man begins to confront his own anima, the inner feminine that Jung described as both muse and tormentor. Through her silence, he begins to sense this aspect within himself, the intuitive feeling receptive part he has long disowned. At first, he projects it onto her, the fascination, the obsession, the frustration. But slowly, if he dares to look deeper, he realizes she was never the source, only the mirror. Meanwhile, the woman's journey deepens into the realm of spiritual detachment. She discovers that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the refusal to abandon herself in the face of misunderstanding. She stops performing understanding for those who refuse to meet her there. In doing so, she releases the old wounds, the fear of being called cold, distant, complicated. She knows now that her depth is not a flaw. It is a frequency, and only those vibrating at the same level can truly hear it. In Stoic philosophy, Seneca wrote that no one can be happy who is constantly searching for happiness. Likewise, no woman can be free who is constantly explaining her worth. The more she steps into her stillness, the more she realizes that silence itself is an act of trust not in others, but in herself. It is a statement of faith that truth does not require defense, and yet her silence is not passive. It is active, charged with awareness. She listens not to the noise of others, but to the rhythm of her own becoming. Each moment of misunderstanding becomes a teacher, each rejection a purification. What once felt like exile becomes initiation into self-respect, into feminine sovereignty, into the calm power of presence. Those around her begin to feel it. Conversations shift when she enters the room. Men who once interrupted now hesitate. They sense that words must be earned in her presence. She doesn't demand this respect, she emanates it. That is the essence of true power, not dominance but gravity. It is the energy of someone who has nothing to prove because she has already proven it to herself. But for the man, still caught in his projections, her silence is unbearable. It exposes the hollow echo of his own unintegrated self. He begins to realize that his control was never over her, but over his own discomfort. Without her explanations, his insecurities echo louder. He may call her cold, detached, cruel. Yet what he truly feels is the terror of irrelevance. This is where Jung's principle of individuation extends beyond the personal. Her silence initiates his awakening. Whether he accepts it or not, she becomes his psychological threshold, the gateway to his own transformation. In her detachment, he encounters his need for validation. In her quiet, he meets his fear of the unknown. And through her absence, he begins perhaps for the first time to hear the voice of his own unconscious calling him to evolve. But she is not waiting for him to arrive. The era of waiting has ended. She walks now with the wisdom of one who has learned the sacred balance, compassion, without codependency, love, without loss of self-connection, without captivity. Her silence no longer hides pain, it radiates peace. In that peace, she becomes untouchable, not because she is distant, but because she is whole. Her power no longer comes from being needed, but from being. And the man who once trembled at her silence begins perhaps silently to revere it. Because deep down, he understands what Jung meant, that the greatest terror is not the loss of another, but the meeting with oneself. There comes a point when silence becomes a woman's language, not of retreat, but of revelation. It is not the silence of defeat, but the silence of transcendence. She has passed through explanation, justification, persuasion, and found all of them wanting. What remains is pure presence, distilled and unyielding. Her silence no longer speaks to the man. It speaks to the world. It tells a story of every time she was doubted, dismissed, misunderstood, and yet chose not to harden. It carries the weight of every apology she gave to preserve peace that never existed. It vibrates with the clarity that comes only after disillusionment. She has seen what happens when you give your truth away for belonging, and she has chosen something rarer, belonging to herself. In Jungian terms, this is the moment of individuation, the sacred union of opposites within. The feminine has embraced her inner masculine not as dominance, but as discernment. She no longer seeks safety outside of herself because she has become her own protector. Her emotions, once labeled too much, now serve as navigational instruments guiding her toward authenticity. And in that integration, her silence becomes the language of mastery. For the man who encounters this version of her, the experience is both magnetic and destabilizing. He cannot explain why he is drawn to her, why her calm feels more powerful than his certainty, why her lack of effort feels like the ultimate seduction. It is because she embodies the archetype of the integrated feminine, a living paradox of softness and strength. To the masculine unconscious, this evokes awe, but to the unhealed ego, it evokes terror. He feels the dissonance between his desire to possess her and his awareness that she cannot be possessed. She is no longer reacting to him, and so his power over her dissolves. What remains is his reflection in her stillness, raw, unedited, uncomfortable. That is why men fear the silent woman. She becomes the mirror of their own spiritual unfinishedness. This silence tests everything. It reveals whether a man's love is grounded in control or reverence in ego or soul. The man who needs constant reassurance will crumble before it. The man who seeks union will kneel to it. Silence becomes her altar, and only those who can handle their own echoes may approach. You, the woman who has stopped explaining, now understand the paradox. Silence does not distance you from truth, it brings you closer to it. Each time you resist the urge to justify your feelings, you reclaim authority over them. Each time you remain still in the face of misunderstanding, you refine your energy. The world may call it coldness, but it is in fact self-respect at its highest vibration. This detachment does not mean you no longer feel. It means you feel everything but selectively. You have learned to discern between noise and signal, between love and attachment, between interest and intention. Silence sharpens this discernment. It filters out what is false. In that clarity, something miraculous happens. You begin to attract different frequencies. Those who approach you now must do so with consciousness, because manipulation cannot survive in the light of presence. People either rise to meet you or fall away not by your choice, but by energetic law. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When you stop explaining, you make the unconscious conscious. You stop living by reaction and begin to live by design. The man who once trembled at your silence begins to change if he is capable of it. The fear that once made him defensive now becomes curiosity. The anger that once sought to control you becomes introspection. Your absence teaches him what your words could not. That love is not earned through dominance, but through awareness. He begins to sense the difference between being loved and being needed. That realization humbles him. But you are no longer invested in his awakening. You have crossed a threshold that no longer revolves around him. This is not indifference. It is liberation. You can love without losing yourself, care without carrying, listen without absorbing. Your silence has turned into sovereignty. In Stoic thought, Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." In Jungian depth, we might say the peace of your soul depends on the depth of your self-understanding. You have reached that depth. You have become the calm after the storm. Not because the world has changed, but because you have ceased to fight its noise. To the outside world, you seem mysterious, perhaps even intimidating. But within, there is peace, the kind of peace that does not come from having all the answers, but from no longer needing to explain them. You have dissolved into presence, and that presence is enough. Men will continue to be drawn to that stillness. Some will mistake it for emptiness, others for arrogance, but the ones who have done their own shadow work will recognize it for what it truly is, the divine feminine in equilibrium, neither chasing nor retreating, simply being. And in that being, you become untouchable not as armor, but as essence. You do not close your heart. You refine its openings. You do not reject the world. You simply choose when and how to let it in. In this state, even silence becomes poetry, and presence becomes prayer. You no longer explain. You simply exist, and the world reorganizes itself around your truth. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.